Okay, welcome back to APES. Today, we're going to finish up the last bit of Unit 9, and then we'll start reviewing to get you ready for the test. So today, we're going to focus on preserving diversity. Even though Unit 9 is not on the AP exam this year, a lot of the FRQs are asking about proposing solutions. So this is focused on providing solutions and why we need to protect stuff. So these are just some examples of species that we are trying to save and some that we've lost, but then we've found again. They're all great examples of why it's important to preserve diversity. The plant you see on the left is a rosy periwinkle. It is a source of an anti-cancer treatment. Here's a fisherman throwing back bluefin tuna that are below size to give them a chance to reproduce. This went extinct, but there are rumors that they have since found it again. This is the golden toad of Costa Rica. Here are poison dart frogs that are being investigated as a possible source of anesthesia. Currently, we are in a mass extinction. The Earth has had 5 mass extinctions before. This one is being linked to humans. And initially, the mass extinction thousands of years ago was because we were eating all the animals. Now the main cause is habitat disruption by human activities. When we talk about biodiversity, it's good on the AP exam to first of all specify diversity. If you're talking about species diversity, which is the number of species, genetic diversity. For example, we've gone from about 3,000 varieties of tomatoes to about 500 varieties of tomatoes because of reduced genetic diversity, as well as ecosystem diversity. Humans have a tendency to turn everything into grassy lawns or palm tree plantations lately. So specify what type of diversity. There's a lot of reasons why you want to protect diversity. By the way, also don't say the phrase promote diversity because that just doesn't make sense with grammar. So we're going to go through all of these, starting with Spaceship Earth, going into food supplies and agriculture, talk about inherent value, pharmaceuticals, and other reasons we don't know. Spaceship Earth was proposed by a scientist named Paul Ehrlich. He, in the 1960s, I believe, described the Earth as a giant spaceship, and every species on the planet is a bolt or screw holding it all together. And he said, if you think about machinery, you can lose 1 or 2 screws and it might still work fine, but eventually you might lose an important bolt and then you're in trouble. And that's how he described a reason for protecting diversity. We often don't know the importance of something till it's pulled out of our food webs. Another thing is food supplies. One awesome thing is once we start eating a plant, we tend to protect it. Once we start eating animals, sometimes they go extinct. One other thing with food supplies currently is monocultures, like monocultures of corn and soybeans, are causing sterilization of the entire landscape. And that is pretty rough. Roundup Ready genes are not linked to any human health problems. The issue with Roundup Ready genes, it allows us to apply Roundup with crop dusters, and it wipes out all the plants on the sides of the fields, including things like milkweed and other plants that are beneficial for pollinators. Another reason to protect diversity is inherent value. Some things are just worth protecting. There is really no commercial value anymore to sea turtles other than some people harvesting their eggs for various reasons and some people wanting the shells for other things. But they're just really important to protect. But remember, last lesson, we also talked about valuation and why it's important to assign value to things or they won't be protected. Pharmaceuticals is another reason why we want to protect diversity. Nature provides an inspiration for so many chemicals that we use in medications. Plants contain chemicals called alkaloids. They're there for defense. They either are decreasing predation or protecting them from other things. One weird thing about alkaloids is a lot of them have structures that benefit humans. The study of alkaloids in plants is amazing. For most of the 20th century, science was kind of disregarding folk medicine. Now there's a field of science started by a gentleman named Mark Plotkin called ethnobotany. And they apprentice scientists with faith healers, folk healers, and just try to find rural indigenous knowledge from all over the world, including the United States. And in doing so, they're constantly finding medications that we never knew existed. Ones, like I mentioned, from the rosy periwinkle. Here, by the way, is the rosy periwinkle. So this is the source of something that is used to treat uterine and ovarian cancer, childhood leukemia. This is the Pacific U from the Pacific Northwest. It is being linked to, it's now being used as a source of Taxol that's being used to treat uterine and ovarian cancer. This plant we see on the bottom is foxglove. Its Latin name is digitalis, and it is the source of heart disease medication. So even something like a willow tree contains a chemical called salicylic acid. For centuries, people knew that if you had a headache, if you chewed on a willow branch, it went away. If you had a wart, you put some willow bark on it, and it would fall off within a few weeks. The reason why is salicylic acid, first of all, dissolves warts. Well, basically, it doesn't dissolve them, it burns them off. It is also the source of aspirin now. There are a lot of threats to biodiversity. Things like hunting and poaching. Smuggling is another problem. Agriculture is a problem. Not all agriculture is bad. The issue is things like palm oil plantations or large-scale feeding operations. Mining is devastating. Habitat loss is a major threat. Even tourism is. Coral reefs are heavily damaged by humans wearing sunscreen, chemical sunscreen, when they're swimming, or even being idiots and standing on coral. This is one of my friends in Hawaii, and when I went diving with them in the reefs or snorkeling, they were amazing. They first gave me a skill test to make sure I could swim in the coral reefs without stepping on them before they took me to the real reefs. And then we also have oil spills, habitat fragmentation, food production, climate change, logging. So lots of threats to diversity. Here's an example of one that is critically endangered. This is bluefin tuna. Bluefin tuna is selling for ridiculously large amounts of money because with supply and demand, as an animal becomes scarce, it goes up in value. So a fish the size of the one you see on the picture on the left would sell for over $600,000 right now, and it'd be divided at high-end sushi restaurants, the kind that none of us could ever afford to go to. Currently, bluefin is critically endangered, and they fear it's going to go extinct by the year 2050 because the ones we're now harvesting are usually below the size of reproduction. So overfishing is one example of how we regulate this. A way to figure out what fish are safe to eat is there's an app you can put on your phone called Seafood Watch. It's done by the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And just so you know, the Monterey Bay Aquarium was founded by Ed Ricketts, who was a friend of John Steinbeck and is mentioned in the book Cannery Row. So the awesome thing about, or the terrible thing about fish is as they become more scarce, and remember the one I just told you about, there was a fish that just recently sold for $600,000. As fish become more scarce, they go up in value, and then it becomes even harder to protect them. So, and this is an issue and this is why we had talked about economics. As supply declines, its value increases. And then it becomes more lucrative to exploit that resource. And there are a bunch of weirdos out there that want to eat the last of something great. Others want it for a pet. I mean, they put or handbags growing in their garden. The list goes on. These are other fish that are currently threatened, and people are encouraged not to eat them. One of the worst being Chilean sea bass, which is too bad because it is delicious. But there's one thing that's even more dangerous for an animal. Besides being tasty, one of the greatest threats to survival of an animal is the insecurity of men. If it is rumored to increase male libido or male performance, that animal is critically threatened. And just so you know, there is no link between things like these rhinoceros horns and male performance. One thing you can do is know your food. So here's the link to the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch. And what it does is it lists fish based on how they're harvested and where they're from. And it's good to know your food. It tells you why certain things are dangerous. Some they're encouraging people not to eat because they're high in mercury. Others, like Chilean sea bass, are now linked with human rights violations. And it depends on where they're getting harvested. So once you do go back to restaurants, if you see something not sustainable on a restaurant menu, I do want to remind you that it is not the waiter or waitress's fault. If you see something that's not sustainable and you're there at dinner time, they are too busy to deal with anything and they have no control over what the restaurant opens. What you could do is call the restaurant the next day during a slow time and speak to a manager to express your concerns politely. And bear in mind, restaurants are not evil villains in this. Sometimes food distributors are selling them food and lying about it. Also, watch your consumer habits. Things like palm oil are devastating the landscape, and palm oil production is now the second biggest source of CO2 after human combustion of fossil fuels. Support businesses with good environmental records. Avoid businesses with poor environmental records. And planting a garden is a huge help. That's why I've been showing you some garden videos, because it provides habitat for pollinators like bees and butterflies. So these are some of the things that I do to help protect the environment. I used to have saltwater aquariums because I'm a raging nerd. But then I found out that a lot of saltwater fish, to harvest them, is not as cute and peaceful as what you saw in Finding Nemo. When they net them in the wild, a large percentage of the fish don't survive the harvest. That is why there's some really awesome operations now. Like there's a program in Hawaii that is lab or factory rearing clownfish and blue tangs to protect them from being overharvested from people being exposed to too many Finding Nemo sequels. So here's another example of preserving diversity that's awesome. This is the Karner blue butterfly. The reason you saw in that last thing that I planted wild lupin, and I did that in Wisconsin, it doesn't grow well here. This butterfly will not fly more than 6 miles without feeding. The only plant it feeds on is the wild lupin. Wild lupin got devastated by clear cutting and forest fires in the Great Lakes region. All it takes to get this butterfly stabilized is to plant more of it wherever you get the chance. So when I lived in northern Wisconsin, I worked at a boarding school called Conserve School, and some of my students figured out there was a patch of Karner blue butterfly 30 miles from our school, and they wanted to invite them to campus. Now, because it's a critically endangered species, you cannot transport it. So they came up with a scheme of having me plant little patches of lupin along roads all the way from Star Lake, Wisconsin to Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin, where this place was located. I did them on public property as well as some friends' properties to kind of make a corridor to connect it to the school. I didn't think it was going to work, but you know, especially in April, May, when teenagers need hope, sometimes I just play along with their requests. Within 3 years, we started seeing these butterflies on the campus of Conserve School, which was an amazing experience. Now, when it gets to protecting species, this is a really fun term, charismatic megafauna. Some animals, especially if they look good on t-shirts, get all of the effort to protect them. And often, sometimes it might be too late for those. So things like rhinos and panda bears, it might be too late. In the case of panda bears, they don't really like to have sex in captivity. Oh, they've just noticed with all the isolation, no one going to the zoos, the pandas are now having sex again. But the issue is if something gets all of the resources towards protecting it, and sometimes you have to do triage and recognize it might be too late for some organisms when there are other things that are easier to save, like the Karner blue butterfly or the monarch or the bees. This, by the way, is a really cool damselfly from my homeland of northern Wisconsin, and its Latin name is Calliopteridae. So, but when we talk about preserving diversity, we also talk about management approaches, because humans, we tend to do bizarre things. Here's an example of bizarre behavior from ecologists. In the 1990s, a prominent ecologist from the East Coast suggested we remove everyone from North Dakota and turn it into a nature preserve to bring back the buffalo. They added there weren't many people in North Dakota. As you can imagine, the people of North Dakota were a little offended by it. At the time in the 90s, North Dakota's population had gone below the minimum level for statehood consideration. But if you think about this from a different perspective, this is what we did to so many Native Americans throughout the United States. So we have this habit of thinking we need to protect diversity by getting people out of there. On the APES FRQs, do not mention that you should remove all people from a place, because that is sinister and wrong. So it gets into how do we preserve diversity and protect landscapes and ecosystems with people around. To find the best approaches, you have to go to places that aren't the United States. So we're going to go over some examples here. The American approach, though, is relocate the indigenous cultures of the people living there, convert it to a nature preserve, and then hire people to go in and protect it. Here is what places like Central and South America have started doing. It's called core habitat design. The tribe you see here is the Bribri. They are in Peru. They have a really cool documentary if you ever want to see it. It's from the 1980s. In the 1980s, the tribe agreed to let a film crew videotape them, and at the tail end of the video, you see them cutting down the one rope bridge connecting their mountain habitat with the modern world. And they said, "We'll talk to you again when you stop screwing things up." Uh, what the government in Peru decided to do was allow this tribe to remain. They didn't force relocation, and as they created a park design, the idea is this tribe remains in their land because in the US, our message of we must protect the land, and even if you've been on there thousands of years, you can no longer be there. So this tribe now coexists with this park. They're the only people allowed in the interior part of the park, and in doing so, it's helping to protect that park from overharvesting and poaching. So the idea with the core park design is you have areas that allow human habitation. The Bribri is allowed to go hunting and gathering in the deep inner core. But other than that, no one else is allowed in there. Another example of this is in Costa Rica. It's this forest preserve called La Selva. Here, there's a tribe called the other tribe, I completely screwed that up. The tribe in Peru is the Kogi, not the Bribri. Excuse me. In La Selva is where the tribe, the Bribri, live. And when Costa Rica became independent, they realized they could afford a military or they could afford healthcare and protecting their natural resources, and they chose to protect their natural resources. They're allowed to not have a military because they haven't pissed off the entire world. In the case of La Selva, they did a core park design, and the Bribri that live there are allowed to live in the major parts of the park, but they're also protecting the inner core. And I got to visit the tribe about 10 years ago. To visit the tribe at the easy to access exterior part of the park, we had to take a bus to this large river, the Sarapiqui. We crossed the river in a dugout canoe with an outboard motor on it. The river was about 200 meters wide. Then we got onto a bus with no windows and a bunch of chickens in it for whatever reason, and bounced down the road for another 2 hours until we came to the end of a road where we then hiked through fire ant piles and about a mile of forest, then crossed another river with no bridge and no boat, just walked across the river and it came up to my chest. And then we walked another quarter mile where we got to visit the tribe. Found out later the tribe has a fake little village for people like the school group I led to visit. But it was an amazing experience. The other thing that La Selva does is, as you can see, it has research stations there. It allows recreation. In the middle of this park, you can go whitewater rafting down the Sarapiqui River, which was an amazing experience. Such a fun experience. And just so you know, that is my canoe paddle right there. Now, protecting aquatic diversity is also a challenge because we have so many things threatening aquatic diversity. In the United States, we have the National Marine Sanctuaries. And these are some of the National Marine Sanctuaries. Monterey Bay is the one, which is by the Monterey Bay Aquarium. One of the coolest ones is Papahanauakoeakea. It became the biggest national marine sanctuary. It's several times the size of California. And that's how you spell Papahanauakoeakea. This was created initially by George W. Bush in his last day in office. It was doubled in size by President Obama. When George Bush created it, it was the biggest national marine sanctuary in the world, which shows you that Republicans also can make environmentally responsible decisions. By the way, another park that George W. Bush created was Flower Garden Banks right here. It's the only coral reef in Texas coastal waters. George W. Bush's family had the mineral rights to drill oil on there, but he abandoned it to help protect the only coral reef left in the Texas waters. Another awesome example of protecting diversity is this area that you see circled right there is Silver Bank. It's just north of the Dominican Republic and owned by the Dominican Republic. By the way, that's Turks and Caicos right there. Silver Bank has no emergent land. It is the healthiest reef left in Caribbean waters. One reason why is it's not easily accessible. What the Dominican Republic did to protect it from its biggest threat was going to be tourists damaging the reef. is they only allow a limited number of dive companies to use that reef. And by having multiple dive companies, if anyone damages the reef, the other dive companies will turn it in to protect the reef. I got to see this in college because I worked on a research boat and we were hired to help map the reef to make dive charts or dive maps for the Dominican government so that there were safe mooring areas so that no one would damage the reefs. One reason why the Dominican Republic has such a cool reef, or one reason why we're able to map it, is this right here is the Polyzany. It was a shipwreck that was smuggling drugs that ran up on the reef, sadly damaging part of the reef, but it gave a visual reference to allow accurate mapping of the reef. One of the other cool things about this reef is it's massive. And this is where humpback whales in the North Atlantic take their babies to raise them, nurse them, and teach them how to breach. We saw so many humpback whales there, we reached the point where we grew tired of seeing them. And just so you know, their breath is really bad. So another part of preserving diversity is discussing environmental ethics. Throughout this year, we talked about the difference between preservation and conservation. Preservation would be people like John Muir. Wilderness has inherent value. Conservation has, one of their leaders was Gifford Pinchot. We must maintain wilderness for future economic use, but not deplete it. And right now, your brain is wired to figure out which one is right. The important thing to understand is both of them are right. You need both. Deep ecology, we already talked about, is humans are a part of nature, and doing so, we're part of the ecosystem, and the planet should, and we have the ability to use our role for the best. The best example of this is from Spider-Man. With great responsibility, or with great power comes great responsibility. And if you think about it from an ethics standpoint, if we're capable of great destruction of the environment, we're also capable of fixing things. And stewardship includes management, study, intervention, protection, and most importantly, realizing we're part of the environment. Even if you don't go out there and plant milkweed to save the monarchs, or plant lupin to save the cardinal blue butterfly, or put in bee and butterfly pollinator gardens to help protect our pollinators, even just voting responsibly is really important. I'm not telling you how to vote, but make sure you're considering all aspects when you vote in an election. We already talked about environmental activism in the other video this week. The first stage is recognizing that there's a problem, identifying the cause, and then these are the parts that humans are terrible at doing: finding solutions and taking actions. We tend to just go out in the streets and scream a lot or complain, but we never try to fix things. So remember, doing solutions is easier than you think. In the next few weeks, I'm going to show you how to put in bee and butterfly gardens on your property. So here are forms of political activism. So voting, the Green Party, except for when it splits the vote and causes problems, thanks to people like Jill Stein. Lobbying is, any of you can go to the state capitol and badger and harass politicians to protect things that you think are worthy of protecting. You can even contact city council. You could be on city council once you're 18. Writing to politicians, protesting, speaking out, rallies. So these are all really awesome examples of activism. Grassroots activism we already talked about, and it's small local steps. Things like community gardens, purchasing land, volunteering, highway cleanups, prop watch to look for invasive species. Here are some students I worked with at Conserve School, and we went in to remove a nuisance tree that was increasing forest fire danger in northern Wisconsin. So that activism involved a bunch of loppers and cutting down tiny little saplings. So, really cool examples. The APES curriculum recommends that I talk about radicalism. Radicalism is eco-terrorism, and the class example of it is this group called Earth First. Greenpeace would be another one. Ed Abbey, who's this guy you see here who shot out his TV, inspired Earth First. He wrote the book, The Monkey Wrench Gang. And as I discovered in college, if you write a paper defending Earth First, you end up getting on the FBI watch list. I probably deserved it by what I wrote, so it's my own fault, but do not write papers defending Earth First, especially on the APES exam, because, you know, it makes airport security a little bit more of a nuisance. In the Monkey Wrench Gang, he happens to tell people how to partake in eco-terrorism, which is making destruction of the environment through things like logging and mining very expensive by disabling the machinery. Just so you know, if you do more than $500 of damage to property, it's a felony. And then you lose your right to vote. So Ed Abbey's not really the best example of a good environmentalist, because in the case of Earth First, there are no official members or leaders, and they've been linked to several deaths from their activities. So it is considered a terrorist organization. By the way, the picture you see on the right of Ed Abbey, he decided the biggest enemy of the environment were TVs, so he did a little news thing where he shot his TV on camera. There's better ways to take action than eco-terrorism, though. And remember, no problem is ever too big. Speaking out environmental issues is only part of it. As Wangari Maathai said, if you're only doing that, you're just talking. And remember, don't break the law. It is illegal. Here's a quote from Ed Abbey. And the reason I don't want you to emulate Ed Abbey is everybody reads the Monkey Wrench Gang and they decide he's their hero. Ed Abbey was originally a park ranger. He wrote a beautiful book called Desert Solitaire. His favorite park where he worked was Glen Canyon. It got flooded with a dam operation, which made him a very bitter person very quickly. If you read his last book, you'll realize he was so miserable that he drank and abused drugs to the point where it's what did him in. His advice right here is really good advice. So I suggest you read it sometime because he didn't read it, even though he wrote it. Here's a better environmentalist to emulate. This is Wangari Maathai. And we've already seen this quote before. Here's a little video discussing that's animated about the hummingbird. So if you want to check this out, there's the link to it. You can find it on the PowerPoint as well. So that finishes Unit 9, everyone. We're going to start reviewing in the next lessons. Thank you.